Our final lecture for the quarter is on South America. We're going to focus specifically on the Andes simply because you don't have enough time to do Eastern South America also. But keep in mind as we go through this, of course, things are going on in the eastern half of the continent also. Let's take a look at the environment. From Ecuador, and again, we're going to focus on this part of South America. So from Ecuador up to the coast, we see relatively low mountains. So that means rains can actually go through and across, and we get plenty of vegetation in this area. But as we head south, we have a totally different story on the western side of the Andes. So the mountains start to get progressively higher as you head south. Two parallel ridges form that you can see here. In between, we get mountain valleys and some lakes. On this western edge, going from the ridge down to the coast, it gets progressively drier. Now we do see rivers, of course, running down from the mountains from glacial melt-off and from snow melt, but the river valleys are really narrow. They're circumscripted, and that's where the population then concentrates. So we see two basic ecological systems in the Andes region. We have the High Sierra, and then we have the desert coast. So let's look at the High Sierra first. We're talking decent farmland, but kind of limited as to what plants will grow depending on the altitude. So tubers actually do well at high altitude, so we see a lot of tubers in the diet. We also see agropastoralism, so a combination of crops and animals. This is the area where camelids were domesticated, so we have llamas and alpacas, and those are the biggest kind of beasts of burden that were domesticated in the Americas. Now, high altitude itself can pose some physical problems for people, and we have both biological and cultural means to kind of address these. So hypoxia is simply lack of oxygen. So the higher you go, less oxygen, it makes it difficult for us to operate. We have increased UV radiation. Atmosphere gets thinner, not as much to block UV radiation, and we get increased heat loss because it gets colder as we get higher. Now hypoxia, there are some biological adaptations to this. Number one is over time, as we acclimate, we'll start to produce more red blood cells. Over a longer period of time, we'll also get increased chest dimensions. So larger lungs equals more oxygen. And we actually see that all across the world in high altitude populations where they have increased chest dimensions. We see darker skin for UV radiation. That tends to protect us. And more capillaries helps with heat loss, as does shorter stature, as there's less surface area to radiate heat back out of the body. So those are some of the kind of developmental physical responses that we get to high altitude. Culturally speaking, if you were suffering from high altitude problems in the Andean highlands, you'll get a cup of coca tea. So yes, that's the same plant that cocaine is made out of, but it's not the same because it's not synthetically processed like cocaine is. But the coca helps to increase breathing. It makes you breathe faster. It also makes your heart work a little bit faster, so you're pumping more blood. So again, more oxygen to the body. So workers that work at like 17,000 feet in the Andes actually chew coca leaves so that they can maintain the ability to work at such a high altitude. And of course, there's clothing also that's going to help with high altitude, particularly the coldness. Now on the desert coast, we see really rich fishing grounds from Peru all the way down to Chile. We see farming again along the rivers. There are very narrow river valleys, and when I say the word circumscription, hopefully that's kind of triggering something in your memory, because we have talked about circumscription before when we talked about the rise of state-level societies and Carneiro circumscription theory. It does seem to work pretty well here in the Andes. So you get farming along the rivers because of the seasonal runoff. They do have to irrigate, though. As you can see, it's pretty dry there. One of the world's driest deserts is in this western area of South America. It's the Atacama Desert. It's also where we see one of the first identifiable cultures emerge in South America, so it's pretty interesting. The reason it's so dry is because when the Pacific rains come in, they tend to go up over the mountains, and they don't drop rain, or it doesn't rain until you get to higher elevations. So the rain doesn't get to the coastal regions, and that's what causes it to be so dry in this particular area. And then the Atlantic rains can't get over the mountains themselves. So it's kind of interesting. Through time in South America, we kind of see shifting powers. So we start out in the desert, we go up to the highlands, we come back to the desert, we go back up to the highlands. So we do see this kind of pattern emerge, and it usually coincides with extended periods of drought. So we do see some ecological factors in that particular, or in this particular area. So we're going to look just really briefly at the Archaic period. The site we're going to use as our example is Guitarrero Cave. It was first occupied at least by 10,000 BP, possibly a little bit earlier than that. Some of the earliest human remains have been found in South America, and hopefully you can think back to when we did Peopling of the Americas, we talked about that. At Guitarrero, we find evidence of textile use and a very simple knotting kind of technique to make the textiles. Textiles over time are very, very important in South America, as we see in some other cultures also. There's a number of functions that textiles can perform, and I'm not trying to say these all function for this archaic period, but again, over time, we know these functions emerge. So the textiles can help identify people. So villages often have a very particular textile that goes with them. So if they're out somewhere and about, somebody sees them, they can see the textiles, they know immediately where they're from. Political gifts. We know that the Inca often used textiles as gifts for people. They can be a part of sacrifice. The cloth itself can be sacrificed. Oftentimes it's included with sacrificial victims. We find it wrapped around mummies, and we're going to talk about some of the ice mummies a little bit later. And it can also be used for currency. So again, these are just some of the functions that textiles can play in a society beyond, using them to make clothes and blankets and so forth. Another thing we can find out from Guitarrero is a pan-Andean connection. So there was always connection between the people in the West and the people in eastern South America. The reason we know this is because at this particular cave we find spider monkey bones, and they're not on the western side, they're only in the Amazonian rainforest area. We find lima bean seeds, peanuts, and coca. So again, all things from the rainforest area. Camelid domestication, again, we find remnants of llama and alpaca. The llama are really kind of the ones that become the major herd animal there, but it's not the only one that the Andeans domesticated. We also find the other domesticated animal in this region is the guinea pig. Still used today, kept in kitchens. It's one of the reasons we see kind of high ledges before you go into a house, and that's to keep all the little guinea pigs in the house and not running outside. Now, one of the most interesting culture groups that we've discovered from